there a possibility that you've lived before? Is the timeline of our consciousness less of a straight line and more like a circle? Welcome to Psychomanteum. I'm Karin Shah. Today we peek behind the mirror into the fascinating belief of reincarnation. We start in Delhi, India in 1926 at the birth of a girl named Shanti Devi. By all accounts, she did not speak much until the age of 4, but as soon as she did, she began to mention her previous life. When given food, she would reminisce about the sweets she used to eat at her home in Mathura, about 150 kilometers away, or as soon as she was dressed, she would talk about the clothes she wore at that time. She told her parents she had been married to a cloth merchant and about the color of her old house, and described the buildings around it. At first, her parents hoped these assertions were merely childish imagination and mostly ignored them so she could forget. There was a belief at the time that if a child remembered their past life and the memories turned out to be true, they were not likely to live. However, Shanti continued to repeat these apparent memories and began to plead to be taken to Mathura. Eventually, her story became well known in the neighborhood. As time passed, she continued asking to be taken to Mathura and became so desperate to travel there that when she was only 6, she ran away to try to go there. Not long after being brought home, she told her teacher and the headmaster at school that she died from complications of childbirth 10 days after having given birth to a son. And though at first she was reluctant to name her husband, finally she said his name was Kedarnath Chobi. The headmaster discovered that a man by that name did live in Mathura, and that he had had a wife who passed away 9 years earlier in the exact circumstances Shanti had described. The woman's name had been Lugdi Devi. After Kedarnath Chobi was contacted, he decided to journey to Delhi to visit Shanti. But when he arrived, in order to test her, he pretended to be his brother. Shanti, however, was not fooled. She identified him and his son immediately. She was very motherly toward her son during the visit, despite the fact that he was older than she was. She was so eager to give him a toy that she didn't wait for her mother to unlock the cupboard where they were kept, but grabbed the keys and got one out herself. Kedarnath Chobi interviewed her privately, and according to him, she gave many details that only Lugdi would know. And soon he was convinced that Shanti was the reincarnation of his late wife, Lugdi Devi. Although Shanti was very happy about the visit, when they left, she begged to go with them, and rather than quelling her need to go to Mathura, she became even more insistent. These happenings then came to the ears of Mahatma Gandhi himself, and he arranged for the case to be investigated. Under the urging of these investigators, Shanti's parents were convinced to allow Shanti to travel to Mathura. A large group headed there, including her parents and the investigators. Shanti was extremely happy and excited at the trip, and as they arrived on the train, her language became more typical of the dialect of Mathura, and she noted that they had arrived too late for a local temple to be open. Once getting down from the train, she caught sight of an older man and went over to him and bent over to touch his feet, a sign of respect in Hindu culture, offered to parents and other older honored persons. When asked who the man was, she whispered that he was her brother-in-law, and it turned out he was indeed the older brother of Kedarnath Chobi. The group further tested Shanti by having her direct the driver on where to go in what should have been a completely unfamiliar town. Shanti correctly led the way past landmarks which she identified and even pointed out buildings that didn't exist when she had lived there before, and pointing out that the road had not been tarred back then either. Shanti correctly led them to a house where she used to live and continued to recognize and identify people she had never met and satisfy questions asked to her in terms not familiar to people from Delhi. She then led them to the house she had lived in when she died, insisting she had money underground there. She showed them where a well used to be, although it was not currently visible, and Karin demonstrated there had indeed been a well there. Then Shanti led them upstairs to her old room. Once the room was unlocked, she ran to a corner and encouraged Karin to lift a part of the floor, exposing a place where valuables could be hidden. They opened the container, but there was no money there. And Karin said he had taken the money out after Lugdi's death. After this, they went to her past life parents' home, and Shanti, though she had seemed to have no recollection of her parents from her previous life when she'd been in Delhi, identified her mother and father from an extensive crowd of around 50 people. It was a very emotional homecoming with many tears. In the end, the investigators concluded that Shanti was the reincarnation of the woman known as Lugdi Devi. Shanti Devi continued to tell her story until her death in 1987. Our next story is that of James Leininger. Born in San Francisco in 1998, James seemed like any normal baby. But shortly after the family moved to Louisiana, not long after his second birthday, James started having nightmares. At first, these episodes, accompanied by screaming, crying, and kicking, seemed like an alarming but likely benign symptom of a move to an unfamiliar house and an unfamiliar room with new surroundings and sounds. But rather than going away with familiarity, James's nightmares began to occur almost nightly. Initially, James's mother, Andrea, had been unable to make out words in her son's outbursts, but one day she realized she could. The young child, who still had the lisp common in early speakers and who was barely able to speak complex sentences, was yelling about a plane crash and saying the plane was on fire and the little man can't get out. Andrea later asked James who the little man was, and he replied, "Me." Being Christians, the Leiningers had never put any thought into reincarnation, but Andrea, at least, began to suspect her son was remembering a past life. Little clues started to come together. When taken to the James Cavanaugh Flight Museum in Dallas previously, James had seemed unusually fascinated by the planes, so much so that it had been difficult to get him to leave. Further, he had identified a small object beneath a toy plane as a drop tank when his mother had mistakenly called it a bomb. Andrea herself hadn't even known what a drop tank was, and furthermore, he couldn't even pronounce the R in drop tank correctly. How could he know what one was? Then he started adding details. His name had been James, he said. His plane had taken off from a boat. Then he gave the name of the ship, the Natoma. His father told him that sounded Japanese, but James insisted it was American. He gave more details, saying his plane crashed near Iwo Jima and that he had had a friend named Jack Larson. His fascination with planes and the events in his nightmares seemed all-consuming. He drew innumerable pictures of planes and the crash. When playing, he frequently mimicked his toy planes crashing. He even signed his drawings James 3. When his mother asked him why, he said it was because he was the third James. Though James's father, Bruce, had originally doubted his son's stories could have any validity, Bruce decided to start investigating them, if only to rule them out. He discovered that there was a U.S. carrier called the USS Natoma Bay, which had served in the Pacific. Networking with some of the veterans from the Natoma Bay, he found out there had been a man named Jack Larson. Larson had survived, but there had been a pilot killed from the Natoma Bay. His name was James M. Houston, Jr. He had not been flying the kind of plane little James had referenced when he'd crashed, but he had flown that kind of plane before. put in touch with Anne Barron, Houston's surviving sister. She confirmed many of little James's stories about James Houston's life growing up in Pennsylvania, including that James Houston's mother had painted a picture of Anne as a child. James Leininger also made statements about things he said happened before he was born, accurately describing a hotel in Hawaii his parents had stayed at. He had 3 G.I. Joe dolls he called Billy, Walter, and Leon, and when asked why he'd given them those names, he said it was because that was who had met him when he got to heaven. The Leiningers later identified Billy Peeler, Walter Devlin, and Leon Connor as squad mates of Houston's who had been killed before he'd been shot down. Leininger's case has been studied by researchers and profiled on TV shows, including one on Netflix. Are these cases the best evidence for reincarnation? In the case of Shanti Devi, 2 more reports were submitted later that refuted the conclusion that she was the reincarnation of Lugdi Devi, but despite this, many find her case compelling. As for James Leininger, there are some skeptics who propose he may have been unconsciously or consciously influenced, but many of those skeptics' facts have been refuted. Jim Tucker of the University of Virginia has investigated James's case and remains convinced. When I was in college, I attended a performance of hypnotist James Mapes. The show included Mr. Mapes attempting to hypnotize members of the audience. About 5 people proved to be suggestible, and they were called onto the stage. He proceeded to hypnotize them and eventually regress them beyond their childhoods to a time before they were born, to another life. I've always been a skeptical person, and I have long forgotten the majority of the show, but there are 2 people whose experiences stuck with me. One was a man who purportedly thought he was a cockroach. I remember it not just because his claim was so surprising, but also because his movements as a cockroach were really funny. His belief he was a cockroach really struck me because, up until then, I had dismissed past lives for the most part because people always claimed to be famous figures like Cleopatra. How could so many people have been Cleopatra, after all? But his belief he was an insect fell more in line with the traditional Hindu and Buddhist ideas of reincarnation, which made it feel more authentic, since the man was a white American and far more likely to be, at least culturally, Christian. The second person whose regression I remember was even more compelling to me. First, the woman who was regressed believed she was a soldier in the Civil War. While this is a fairly typical past life idea, the gender switch felt less than typical. And second, she told us her name, and the surname she gave was both uncommon and a family name of one of my relatives. Personally, I find these remembrances of people under hypnotic regression less convincing than those remembered spontaneously by children. These children, who are usually between 2 and 4 when they recall these apparent memories, are too young to have all the influences of adults, and they usually forget their past lives by the age of 7. Reincarnation is hardly a new idea. It's a central tenet in one of the oldest extant religions in the world, Hinduism, as well as Sikhism, Jainism, and Buddhism. Some more mystical sects of Judaism have a version of reincarnation called Gilgalim. Some argue early Christianity also flirted with reincarnation, with an influential Christian suggesting the soul exists before a person is born. However, scholarship is mixed on that point. But what do you think? Have you lived before? Ever been regressed, or have your parents tell you that you talked about a past life as a child? Tell me your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Thanks for listening. Please drop us a like and subscribe. In the following days, look for more stories, both true and fictional, and explorations of all things creepy and unexplained. If you have a story to share, drop an email to the address in the description. Until next time, think twice before you look behind you in the mirror. There may be something on the other side.